Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Kittner with the Chamber. We're so thrilled to have you all here today for the third program in our legislative series. And I'm going to turn it over to Crystal Ratana with Children's Health to tell us a little bit more about this series and welcome our guest speaker. So, Crystal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Good afternoon, Chamber members and guests. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Crystal Ratana. I am the Director of Community Relations for Children's Health System of Texas and proud Executive Board Member of the North Dallas Chamber, as well as Deputy Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Farmers Branch. On behalf of our board and our Public Policy Committee, I'd just like to welcome you to part 3 of our North Dallas Chamber Legislative Series. As you know, due to the ongoing pandemic and legislative visitation guidelines and so forth, we opted to replace our traditional day at the state with the virtual series featuring legislators, other elected officials, journalists, lobbyists, and others participating in the legislative process this session. This series could not be possible without the support of our dedicated sponsors, ACOM, Bradley, Frost Bank, HDR, HNTB, Jacobs, Encore, Texas Health Resources, Reliant, Pulsanelli, and of course, Children's Health. Just a quick reminder, if everyone would please stay on mute throughout the duration of our program. We want to make sure that we give everybody the ability to be able to listen in to our guest speakers today. So thank you so much for joining us. We at Children's Health, we're one of the largest and most prestigious pediatric healthcare providers in the country and the leading pediatric healthcare system in North Texas. Children's Health System includes the flagship hospital, of course, Children's Medical Center in Dallas, as well as Children's Medical Center Plano, our Children's House, the Children's Healthcare Network, specialty centers, rehabilitation facilities, and physician services. Recently, Children's Health and UT Southwestern announced its first joint pediatric enterprise initiative at the reimagined Redbird development, which many of you have, I'm sure, have heard of. And our goal is to broaden access in the southern sector of Dallas to the region's top pediatric care. The project marks the first major collaborative initiative since the two organizations announced our joint pediatric enterprise in October of 2019. Our goal, as many of you know, is to ensure that our community has access to quality care, which is why I'm so honored to introduce today's topic, Medicaid expansion, and our guest speakers, Mr. Steve Love and the Honorable Senator Nathan Johnson. Mr. Love is currently President and Chief Executive Officer of the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council, which promotes collaboration, cooperation, and advocacy on behalf of its 90 member hospitals. The Hospital Council also has approximately 100 associate members, including prominent accounting, legal, and consulting firms. The primary mission is to promote patient safety, quality healthcare, and coordination in the delivery of healthcare within the North Texas market. Prior to joining the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council, Mr. Love was Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of a Fortune 500 healthcare company that owned over 50 hospitals and managed approximately 200 facilities in the United States. Senator Johnson was elected with strong bipartisan support in 2018. He represents economically and demographically diverse Senate District 16, which comprises the northern part of Dallas County. He graduated magna cum laude with a degree in physics from the University of Arizona and earned his law degree from the University of Texas at Austin. He practices law in the trial practice group at the law firm of Thompson and Knight. He also composed music for the classical concert stage and scored the hit television series Dragon Ball Z, which still amazes me to this day. So we'll definitely have to expand on that one day, Senator Johnson. Last session, he had a very successful session, which also focused on healthcare. He passed 22 bills into law during the first legislative session, all with bipartisan support. His emphasis on improving the health of Texans prompted a number of healthcare initiatives in the 87th session. The cornerstone of Senator Johnson's agenda is Senate Bill 117, the Live Well Texas program, a nonpartisan proposal to expand healthcare coverage in Texas while preserving state control over funds and generating positive net revenue for the state. Like SB 117, the senator's suite of healthcare bills represent a practical approach to government guided by the desire for people to succeed and informed by research and consultation with advocates, experts, and leaders. Thank you both so much for joining us today and being part of this very important topic this session. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Steve Love and the Honorable Nathan Johnson.
Well, thank you, Crystal. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. The North Dallas Chamber always puts on great events, and it really is an honor to be on the panel with Senator Nathan Johnson, who not only is a great person and a friend to all of us, but really tries to do things in a very bipartisan way, which I think we all appreciate. So Nathan, I'm delighted to be on the panel with you today.
Me too, Steve. Privilege and honor, as always, and to see so many of my friends from the North Dallas Chamber. Really, one of the leading business voices in the state, I think. And there's large equipment falling off my roof as we speak, so you may feel some noise. It's not normal, but there's nothing about the past 12 months that has been normal, so it's in that way normal.
Well, Senator, if it's okay with you, I talked to Jeff just briefly before we started. I was going to give just a quick overview, lay of the land, and then turn it over to you to really tell folks more about your Live Well bill and looking in your crystal ball, what's going to happen at the legislature. Is that okay with you?
That's terrific.
Okay. You know, I know many of you have heard about Medicaid expansion. We've been hearing about it since the onset of the Affordable Care Act. And, you know, just as Crystal said, we're one of the few states that has not expanded Medicaid. We're down to about 12 states. And, you know, it really, I think, has been a matter of people just being more against it than for it. For example, there was a poll that was taken by the Episcopal Health Foundation, and 64% of Texans support Medicaid expansion. We currently have the highest uninsured rate in Texas. You know, many people think it's 5 million. It's really about 5.5, 5.6 million now when you add in the people that lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19. So, you know, we're well at 20%. So when you walk down the street, every fifth person you see in Texas has no health insurance. That's going to give them coverage and access. Now, why should we expand Medicaid? Well, one of the most compelling things that I can say, I don't know about you, but April 15th is going to be here before you know it. You have to pay federal income tax. We're one of the few states that pay federal income tax to expand coverage and pay for it in Massachusetts and New Mexico, in Arkansas, in Louisiana, soon to be Oklahoma. So the question I always ask, why would we pay for healthcare in other states and yet we won't use those same dollars to pay for our fellow Texans? That has always amazed me that we cannot explain that. The second thing that really impresses me is I really respect the Perryman Group, and they've done a lot of research on this. I respect the Bush School at Texas A&M. They've done a lot of research on this. And they say, and this is conservative, that $5.4 billion would come in annually to Texas if we did this expansion. The federal government would fund 90%. We would fund 10%. I think the senator, and I won't steal his thunder, is even going to tell you how it might be 95% potentially, depending on some current federal legislation. And the Ray Perryman Group says, if nothing else, there are three things that come out of Medicaid expansion. One, it makes for a robust economic condition and it creates new jobs. That's number one. Number two, it helps reduce the uncompensated care. It's not going to take care of all of it, but it's going to take care of a good portion of it. And by doing so, you can take some of the public and private funding currently and redirect those funds. The final thing, people are going to be healthier. We're going to cut down on mortality and morbidity. That means a more productive workforce. So it's good for business, it's good for industry. The University of Michigan released a study last year where they estimated 730 Texans lose their lives every year because we have not expanded Medicaid. Now, I know people can have different statistics and look at this different ways, but I have a lot of respect for the Kaiser Family Foundation. They've looked at 400 different analyses related to states that have expanded Medicaid, and they say it absolutely improves the health, it improves outcomes, and it creates coverage and access to some of the most vulnerable in our society. It's not a welfare program. Of the people that would qualify under Medicaid expansion, 75% of them are in a family that has someone that's employed and working, but they fall into that coverage gap where they may be under the poverty level. But in Texas currently, essentially, you're pregnant or you're disabled or elderly to really qualify for Medicaid. If you're single and you're under the federal poverty level and you're not pregnant, you don't really qualify. So there's a coverage gap there, and it's also a coverage gap between the poverty level up to 138%. So I'm not trying to get too complex here, but now is the time from an economic point of view for us to expand Medicaid. We had a Republican come out, and I think it's been 24 bills probably filed, the senator will know, on Medicaid expansion, but Representative Lyle Lawson came out recently with House Bill 1730. He's a Republican, and he said, if we don't expand Medicaid, we're making a bad business decision. So all I can say, it's really time for Texas to look at this. I have two final comments, and I'll turn it over to our distinguished senator. But one thing people forget, if you're worried about the 90% going away, let's do what a Republican governor did in Arizona. Jan Brewer put a material adverse event clause in their Medicaid expansion, saying if the federal government ever fell short of what they promised to pay, the entire expansion would blow up and it would go away. So she put a safety valve in that legislation, and Arizona expanded. The other thing, I'd be remiss, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News by Aaron Yelowitz, who's a professor of economics in Kentucky, and he said Texas should be wary of Medicaid expansion and the Medicaid creep. Well, that was the headline. If you really read the article, he's talking about people that inappropriately get on Medicaid, or people that are vetted and the state enrollment process was flawed and there was waste. I don't think anybody on this call wants waste. And anybody who fraudulently signs up, we want to make sure they're taken off because they shouldn't get a benefit they're not entitled to. So if you really read his article thoroughly, he's not against Medicaid expansion. He's just saying have the type of programs in place to monitor enrollment and to make sure that you have protections and regulations in place that the money that is funded appropriately. We're all for that. Let's expand Medicaid and let's do it the right way. So I'm going to stop, but Texas leads the nation in uninsured. Hold that thought, and I'll turn it over to the distinguished Nathan Johnson.
Steve has done an excellent job of laying out the compelling reasons to expand Medicaid. And I know, and for the sake of brevity, Steve was not even including all the good things, because we would be here all day if Steve and I tried to list all of the benefits. But those are the high points. This is economically advantageous. It does stimulate the economy. It is good for business. It is good for human beings. So rather than go into the many good things that it does, I want to address the strategic question of, okay, great, we all know that it's a good deal, But broadly speaking, there's still a grade of political fear, political inertia, and just lack of understanding outside the Capitol building about what this means and why we should do it. So how do we overcome the information gap, the bias, the misinformation, the myth peddling? And it's very, very difficult, but it's kind of an exciting moment, really, for healthcare. We aren't just a little closer than we were 2 years ago or 4 years ago. We're way closer. We were nowhere near a few years ago. And right now, as Steve observed, a Republican has filed an expansion bill. It's a simple, straight, we need to expand Medicaid bill that has been filed by Democrats in the House and Democrats that I filed this session in addition. But that's a big statement. And he's going out there. And by the way, so has the former Speaker of the House, Joe Strauss. And I think you're going to see additional Republicans in the coming weeks either filing or joint authoring or publicly stating their support for Medicaid expansion. You won't see 80 come in all of a sudden, but you're going to start seeing some vocal support among Republicans. Strategically, the significance of that is huge because the media, frankly, is a little tired of covering this issue. Some people know it works, some people say it doesn't, and everyone says this time we're going to do it, and it doesn't happen. So it's not really news that Nathan Johnson filed a Medicaid expansion bill, even if it isn't a normal expansion bill, even if it's a waiver, even if it draws in all sorts of Republican elements from other states. It's still not news until, wait, did you say a Republican filed it? Did you say 6 of them are now joint authors? Did you say there's 4 different Republican bills for Medicaid expansion and they're teaming up with the Democrats? Now we got a news cycle. Now we got the whole state going, what is going on in the legislature? I thought this was a taboo subject. Wait a minute, what is this Medicaid expansion thing? Wait, 2/3 of people already approve it. What about that Republican primary voter? I mean, really, that's the wall here. Something very interesting came out of a poll done by Texas 2036, Dallas-based institute run by our own Tom Luce and Margaret Spellings up here. They did a poll, and one of the questions was not, do you favor or not favor Medicaid expansion? It was, at what level of income do you think the state ought to start helping people get health insurance or get health care? And the number they chose was going to line up with the threshold for Medicaid expansion. And they found a majority of Republicans supported the state coming in and providing health insurance to people at the Medicaid expansion threshold. Really interesting, right? So if you don't paint it with some politically supercharged words, people feel that the state should help somebody who can't afford healthcare. Look, if you're below poverty, the definition of poverty is you can't survive on it. That's the federal, a committee got together in the federal government. What is poverty? It means it's the federal poverty level is the level below which nobody thinks you can survive. So if you're below poverty, how cheap does healthcare have to get before you can afford it? You can't ever afford it. So Republicans will recognize that. Republican primary voters can recognize that if you don't dress it up in political costumes. So strategically, could we have a big push? Could the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker all come out and say we need Medicaid expansion? Maybe. I wouldn't put that off the realm of possibilities. More likely, however, we say, you know what? That big old bloated government program is not right for us. But if we get a waiver, we can draw down those exact same healthcare dollars, the same 90-10 match, cover the same population of adults aged 19 to 64 up to 138% of the federal poverty level, whether or not they're married or have kids. Because if they have kids, they're already eligible up to 18% of the federal poverty level, or about $3,500 a year. Oh my gosh. We can draw down those same federal dollars, run that exact same federal program, and have a different set of rules, have a different set of options. Do what the Arizona governor was talking about, which she called an escape hatch. I call it a self-destruct mechanism because it's way cooler. It's like a James Bond feature of SB 117. That if the federal government shocks us all and decides to cut the benefits of one of the most visible programs they have that affects 53 million enrollees nationwide in states with 228 million people and 76 senators, if by chance, nevertheless, they decide to draw that down, plan goes away. Fine, we're not committed to this, but it would be hard to pull it back. Well, I'm not so interested in pulling it back, frankly, because 2/3 of Texans already, we haven't even really talked about it that much, and 2/3 of Texans already support it. It's demonstrated through every analysis that's been done to have worked in other states, and all the projections specific to Texas say it's going to be an economic boom to our state. So the strategy again, let's get support from a small group of Republicans in the House. Let's get the dialogue going. Let's get the business community rallying behind this loudly, providing pressure, providing cover, because sometimes they're the same thing. And then when the conversation gets going, the idea is to get people who are really opposed to this along ideological grounds to just take a time out, go put them in the penalty box for a few minutes and let us play, and not say anything they can't walk back. Some people are going to do it, okay? The Texas Public Policy Foundation doesn't believe in this. It doesn't matter what we say. It doesn't matter what our numbers are. Some people, we're just going to have to go right through them. Sorry, we'll agree with you on something else. I'll join author a different bill with you, but on this subject, we're going to knock you over. Get out of the way. We have some real work to do here. Don't mean to be aggressive, but I've been at this for a while, and I'm kind of tired of people saying things that don't make sense. And Jeff, I know you wanted me to talk about what are some of the arguments. Well, there was a long list of arguments that were being used when I started on this quest, and a lot of people have been involved in trying to debunk them. The first one being that Texas can't afford this, it's too expensive. People aren't saying that with any serious frequency anymore because it just doesn't hold up. So they're resorting to other statements. And Jeff, would you like me to pause or go into the arguments that are prevalent right now that we all need to learn how to brush aside?
No, I think it would be helpful if you could go into some of the arguments and talk about how we respond to those.
All right, well, some of them are much more serious and genuine than others. So I'll start with the ones that have a little more validity and warrant some respect and credibility. First one I call baby steps. You know, Medicaid's expansion is a big thing. Let's just move conservatively. Oh, never mind, it's been 8 years, okay? It's not that wild to go ahead and proceed with this, but the baby steps idea is that let's just go incrementally. Let's take a little bit of what you want to do and then a little bit of my reticence and we'll compromise it. And while that might work in some areas, and we might have a study that does this or that applies to 0.03% of the population, economically, baby steps doesn't work. It fails. Because, and 2036 has also demonstrated this with a very objective analysis. If you do a partial Medicaid expansion, it's going to cost about 800 times as much as it costs per person if you do a full Medicaid expansion. It's more expensive overall, and it's more expensive per person. It draws down dollars at 60-40 instead of 90-10. And the difference between those two is the difference in the fiscal stimulus. That means we can have a break even on a static basis and a net revenue on a dynamic basis from 90-10 that you don't get 60-40. All that, a lot of numbers is to say, baby steps don't work. You got to do a full expansion. You can staple all sorts of other things onto it, like escape hatches and self-destruct mechanisms and health savings accounts and those other things that I've put on my bill, but you got to do the whole thing. Ain't no other way to do it. It's particularly important when you're communicating in the business community, because your average fiscal conservative political moderate will be inclined to say, yeah, no, let's compromise. Let's just go part of the way and see how it works. Let's be careful. No. You've got to do the whole expansion, or it will cost money and it will fail, and we're right back where we were yesterday or where we are today, which is not a good place, as Steve has explained. Baby steps don't work. That's number one. Secondly, coverage, we're going to start to erode credibility here. Coverage is not care. The issue really isn't about giving people health insurance. It's making sure everyone has care. So never mind Medicaid expansion. Let's just make sure everyone has care. I would say if you're serious that coverage isn't a big deal, take out your health insurance card right now and cut it in half right in front of me. Throw out your insurance. Coverage isn't care. Just go get some coverage. Coverage is prerequisite to care. The more serious side of that argument is that there already is difficulty getting physicians or other healthcare providers to provide services under the Medicaid program. That's not an excuse to not expand Medicaid. That's a reason to incentivize healthcare providers to participate in the Medicaid program. There are ways to do that. One of them is in my bill. It's raising the reimbursement rates for healthcare providers from the very low Medicaid rates to the less low Medicare rates. That will cost some money. That's okay. This makes money. We can pay it. There's other ways to pay it. We can do that if you're serious about coverage equaling care. There are all kinds of things by some longtime opponents, like they want to make it easier to license APRNs, all sorts of, or increase funding for graduate medical education. Lots of things that we can do to increase the availability of care. It doesn't mean we should abandon coverage. The second part of the coverage is not care, is that it's really all about cost. That we have a runaway pricing system that renders healthcare unaffordable to people. And if we could just bring the cost down, we wouldn't need Medicaid expansion. And we'll do things like price transparency or little co-ops of primary care physicians where everyone goes to the same church and puts in a little money and we all pay a concierge physician. I won't go through all the arguments to rip that one to shreds, but let's just say it doesn't work for one thing. Secondly, even if it did work, and these are designed generally for higher income people, let's suppose it works for a small group of people. How much are you going to bring that cost down? Again, remember, we're talking about people who are indigent. Are you going to take a doctor's office visit down from $110 to $55? What person who's earning $15,000 a year has an extra $55 to go to a primary care physician? What about when they have appendicitis? What about when they have a urinary tract infection or an ear infection, or they break their arm? I mean, that doesn't work either. I think I'm taking too long, so I'm going to move through the rest of these because they're also not that good. People are worried the federal government will pull the money. We talked about already having the self-destruct mechanism, but also when you look at the economics, the expansion portion of federal budget expenditures are 9% of 14%. That's 9% is the expansion portion of the Medicaid portion, which is 14%. That's 1.17% of federal expenditures annually are devoted to the Medicaid expansion program. That's some of the most visible dollars in the state, some of the most beneficial, economically stimulating dollars we have in our entire federal budget. I do not think there's any way when we're looking to reduce the federal debt load that we're going to look at somehow reducing a fraction of 1.17% that is so visible and so vital to taking care of people and promoting economic activity. So I don't buy that one either. Another one I'll just call fake numbers. Anytime you hear the word California, you know they're misquoting numbers. You'll hear that all the time. In California, 44 billion people flew to the moon and died because of Medicaid. I mean, okay, that's a little bit more extreme than what they're saying, but I've tried to take this stuff seriously. I've gone back and looked at the reports where they cite something about mortality. I went back and looked at the 2017 report using 1992 data. And they're saying the stuff as if it's serious. I'm sorry, if you hear the word California and Medicaid expansion doesn't work, you know that somebody's trying to sell you something that's not true. Or they'll say they're kicking people out of wheelchairs. States that have expanded Medicaid are kicking people out of wheelchairs to pay for it. What are you talking about? How do I argue with that? I don't know how to argue with that. It's just false. So that's just the fake category. Is there one more? Yeah, there is one more, and it's philosophical. And this one I'll take a little bit seriously, and I think we have to, because there are people who feel very, very strongly that everybody who's not covered in Texas today is an able-bodied adult who's choosing not to get a job and trying to just draw down money and benefits off the system. And we don't want to incentivize a culture of dependency, and we don't want to disincentivize work. And my response to that is I don't either. I don't want a culture of dependency, and I don't want to disincentivize work. Now, if you look at the evidence, there is evidence that Medicaid expansion helps people get back to work. Recent data out of Montana showed that the average time to be in the expansion was 2 years, and then they graduate and move out of it. A third of them got out of it within 3 or 9 months. It helps people get back to work. There's not a ton of data on this. There's none that says the other side. There's nothing that I've seen, and I try to shoot holes in my own arguments. I can't find anything that says Medicaid expansion disincentivizes work anywhere across 38 states. As to the philosophical point of I don't want to have a culture of dependency, yeah, I don't either. I know these people can't afford healthcare. The whole purpose of this is to help people who can be productive. And if they're unable to take care of themselves, you know what? I do want to take care of them. I do think that's our job. That's where it breaks down. The last point on the philosophy, and then I will stop here. We are in a position to draw in about $2.5 billion of biennium net revenue. There's a bill pending in Congress right now that I expect to come out before the end of April that would add an additional $5 or $6 billion. Just here, Texas, here's $6 billion if you expand Medicaid. Money that we don't have to spend, that we could spend building a new electrical grid, right? This is serious dollars. If I take your philosophy seriously, that you're afraid of disincentivizing work and you don't want to reward lazy people who don't want to get jobs, okay, I get it. We got these people out here who are unproductive. How much are you willing to reject in the name of your philosophy? How much money are you going to turn down to spite poor people who want healthcare? I think we're past the number. that's my presentation. It's a little less friendly than usual, but it's still bipartisan.
Jeff, I had a couple other comments that I wanted to make too. The senator jogged my memory. You know, for people that say, you know, I feel sorry for people that need Medicaid, but how does it really affect me? Well, the way it affects you is as follows. When these people have no health coverage and no access, it doesn't mean they don't get sick. And they show up at emergency rooms or they show up at places that they can't pay. And we understand that. And, you know, we're going to treat them as something called EMTALA. That's a discussion for another day. But I'll never forget, I was speaking in Fort Worth about 5 years ago, and there was a gentleman there that owned car dealerships. And he was very sincere. He was not being cute. He wasn't. He raised his hand and said, I've never understood cost shifting. Cost shifting, I hear about all this in healthcare. What is it? And I said, why don't I talk to you in automobiles? You realize that we've got 20% uninsured in the state of Texas. That's 1 in 5 people. So today you sell 5 automobiles, but give the 5th one away free. He said, well, I couldn't do that. I'd have to raise the price of the other 4. I said, you now understand cost shifting. And it was like a light bulb went off. And he said, so if I have Blue Cross or if I have Aetna or if I have Cigna or and I have United, this high uninsured problem is affecting me. I said, absolutely. There's no question about it. So for people that don't think Medicaid expansion doesn't affect them, it does. The other thing, the senator went through some of the reasons people don't want to do it. I was talking to a state senator who will go unnamed the other day, and these were his exact words. The Texas Medicaid system is broken. I am not going to put another 1 million people into a broken system. And my response was, well, the state controls it, so why is it broken? And why don't we fix it and then expand Medicaid? The other thing I wanted to ask the senator, because he can explain this much better than me, but forget Medicaid expansion a minute. We have a Medicaid 1115 waiver, and thankfully it just got renewed. Now we're still analyzing it. We're looking at the directed payments. We don't know how we're going to come out because there's a program called DSRIP that's going away. But I've heard people say, Senator, well, we just got the waiver renewed. We don't need Medicaid expansion. What is your response?
My response first is I couldn't read my own handwriting on my notes. I intended to bring that up. Thank you, Steve. The simple response to pointing to the 1115 renewal, the first thing, it's important to distinguish between one 1115 and another. What we're talking about is the old 1115 waiver that we had for 10 years that's expiring, that provides funding for uncompensated care because we haven't expanded Medicaid, and funding for DSRIP, which Steve can explain better than I can. And it all goes away unless we got some sort of renewal or expanded Medicaid. And Abbott negotiated with the Trump administration and did receive a renewal of that waiver, much to the surprise of many people. And what was really staggering was that it wasn't a 5-year renewal, which is typical, it was a 10-year renewal. Okay, so the simple response to what about that and what's its effect on Medicaid? And the answer is it almost has nothing to do with Medicaid expansion. The renewal of the old waiver insures a total of 0 people. It simply provides money to cover uncompensated care in hospitals and possibly the intricacies of what's the fate of old DSRIP funded projects will be under this new waiver is too complex for me to address here. Some of the money will get taken care of and some of it won't, and some of the systems are going to just die and others will be picked up in other ways. There may be some improvements here and there, but it insures 0 people. And we've got 5.5 million uninsured. Medicaid expansion would pick up 1 million. By far the biggest of any other thing we can do, but it still leaves over 4 million uninsured people. We're going to have plenty of uncompensated care. So it's wonderful that we got a renewal of the old 1115, what I call a non-expansion waiver, but it doesn't take care of the million people will pick up with an expansion through a bill like mine, which is an expansion 1115 waiver or an 1115 expansion waiver. Short answer, it's irrelevant. It doesn't insure anybody. Steve, do you think our Medicaid system is broken?
I don't think it's broken. I think it's flawed. I think we need to try to pay the physicians better per diems than we pay them. 25% of the physicians in Texas participate in Medicaid, so 75% don't. So I think it's not broken. I think all the parts are there. I do think as we expand Medicaid, as you already said, let's raise it to at least Medicare rates for the providers to help fix some of that. So I wouldn't use the word broken. I think it needs to be updated.
And I think this choice of words can be very, very important in politics, because if people say it's broken, we're done talking. If
Right.
you say it's flawed, it's like every other system we have. And it brings up another point in a much, I think I was kind of in a hostile mind because you've caught me when I'm exhausted with dumb arguments, but much more in a cooperative tone. There are a lot of ideas for what we need to do to our healthcare system, improve the way Medicaid is run, lower costs. Absolutely, we need to lower costs. And I would love to work with legislators and with policy leaders and hospitals and physicians and APRNs and everybody else on how we can better structure our system to have better health outcomes and lower costs. All of that needs to happen in parallel with a coverage expansion, not in lieu of.
If y'all are okay with it, I want to pick back up on something that Steve raised a couple minutes ago in his conversation with the legislator about Medicaid expansion. And y'all mentioned also the discussions with Rep. Larson and what he's proposed. Senator and Steve, tell us about some of the efforts that you've made with Republican legislators during this session over the last few weeks, and what's been the reaction so far, and then are all the Democrats on board with this at this point?
I'll let the senator go first.
I've been talking with Republican legislators for since last session, frankly, for 2 years. And the efforts have intensified in the more recent months. And the reactions, I'm cherry picking a little bit, right? But I'm not talking about 2 or 3. I've talking about a couple dozen. There's a strong interest among Republican members in finding a way to increase coverage, but not suffer the political consequences of suddenly being a Medicaid expansion cheerleader. Even the latter, as you've seen with Larson's bill, is starting to wane, the concerns there. Both in the Senate and the House, there's a clear recognition of the need to do something. What's slower is recognition that the something is a full Medicaid expansion. That's the something. As we said earlier, you can't take baby steps. We are moving very steadily in that direction. And we have at the highest levels, at the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker, we do not have a slammed shut door at this point. Nobody has embraced it. And it might take all the way up into a special session. I could see Medicaid expansion passing in a special session. I could see it passing in May. I sure hope it does. And that 5% FMAP bump that Steve and I were talking about earlier, the way that works is if we expand it increases our FMAP rate for our existing, not even the new enrollees of an expansion population. It's a bump to our existing Medicaid population, which is worth even more money to us than if they had made it 95.5 on the expansion. So it's a huge amount of money. And at a time when we're talking about reconstructing the grid and dealing with costs of a pandemic and a crushed economy, lower receipts, the idea of rejecting money is going to be really difficult to sell to the public, whatever party you're in. Now, as for the Democrats, Democrats have been calling for expansion from the beginning. Will they be content with something like my SB 117, which deliberately incorporates elements that have been favored in Republican-led states? I think so. I think if you tell them, look, we're going to give coverage to 1 million people, all we are going to do is have a requirement in there that enrollees consult with the Texas Workforce Commission, have job counseling. It's not a work requirement, it's job counseling. They might hate it, but if they have a chance to give healthcare coverage to 1 million people and that's the deal on the table, I feel pretty confident that they'll take it.
Jeff, my response, it's a little different than the senators, but pretty much the same also. I think you got to realize at the hospital council, and we've got hospital representatives on the phone. I know it surprises people, but we treat Democrats and Republicans when they get sick. So we try to be public policy. What's the best for the people? What's the best for the patient? What's the best for public health? And that's why we support Medicaid expansion. I've talked this session to a handful of Republicans, and two have told me they can't really refute my arguments, but they're not going to come out publicly and support Medicaid expansion. And part of the reason is, and I'm not being pointing fingers, I'm just being openly honest. You've got a governor that has not endorsed Medicaid expansion. You've got a lieutenant governor that has not endorsed Medicaid expansion. You've got the attorney general that filed the lawsuit to overturn the Affordable Care Act, and he led that charge. It's before the Supreme Court. People kind of got a good feeling from some of the initial comments by some of the justices. Supreme Court still hadn't ruled on that. I'm not an attorney, Nathan is, and I've heard Nathan say he doesn't think it has legal merit. But when you have that kind of atmosphere from leadership, sometimes it's difficult to get the buy-in from the rank and file legislators. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just being realistic.
It is realistic to look at that, and it is very hard. And I think it's going to take a signal from leadership for members of the legislature to feel comfortable, even just having a serious conversation about this. I mean, they're afraid to even talk about it. But the pressure is building, and I hope that the public, I'll direct this at the public, not at politicians. The public needs to allow politicians to evolve in their thinking. No one should be condemned for coming to a conclusion 8 years later that's different from what it was 8 years earlier, when you have new information, better information, and changed circumstances. It takes an act of courage on the part of the politician to trust the people to give you that benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what needs to happen in Texas. I don't think anybody has to come forward and say, I was wrong. I think they can say, at that time, under those circumstances, this state was not ready and it was too risky of a move. We are now in a different set of circumstances financially, medically, economically, and the benefits are different than they were. A bunch of the uncertainties have been worked out. It's time now to do this. And it's hard, Steve. It really is hard.
It is. It's very difficult.
It's not going to happen unless we make it happen.
And I do agree with you totally. I liked what you said in your press release. Your bill's not a Republican bill. It's not a Democratic bill. It's a Texan bill. It's for the people of Texas.
Right.
And that's really the theme we have to go with.
It is, and it was completely sincere, because this bill is modeled after Republican states, and I'm a Democrat, and I think it's a very good bill. And I think that at the end of this legislative session, if we don't pass it, the other line from there that I still believe very strongly is this has the potential to be a bipartisan success, like public education, or partisan failure. And I don't mean a bipartisan failure.
And y'all, speaking of action and next steps to take, as many of y'all know, one of the chamber's priority issues is expansion of Medicaid, working with Senator Johnson and Steve on that this session. So tell us, what can we in the business community do to help advocate for this? Is it talking to some of the Republican legislators, or is there more that people on this call and others in the business community, leaders, what can we all do?
Well, I'll take the first shot at this, and Senator Johnson has heard this. And to all the nice people on this phone, I hope I don't step on your toes. I apologize in advance. But many years ago, as you know, every session we've tried to expand Medicaid. And I think one year we had close to 70% of the chambers of commerce throughout the state of Texas endorse and support Medicaid expansion. I know the Dallas Citizens Council did. I see Sarah Jackson's on the call, and we thank them for that. But the legislators and the governor and the lieutenant governor need to hear from the Fortune 500 CEOs. When you say you're part of the chamber, that's wonderful, and all the chambers do a good job. But we need powerful business executives making those phone calls in addition to the chamber. And that's my 2 cents.
Steve, I'll simply add to that everything Steve said. And I think the CEOs of less powerful, smaller companies as well, call your representatives, particularly if you're not in a district represented by a Democrat. Call them, let them know you're a business person, you have a conservative fiscal policy, and you believe this is an important thing for the state to do, and that I will support anyone who does it, whatever party they're in.
I want to reserve a little bit of time for audience questions because we've got quite a few. So our first question is from Dr. Mary Tietze with TWU. Doctor, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I don't think she heard you.
Well, let me go ahead and read it. She asked an excellent question, which is, at TWU, we teach and advocate for our APRNs to be comfortable with telehealth services. Regarding Texas Medicaid expansion, is there a benefit for increasing the capability of telehealth services for patients of Medicaid expansion?
Absolutely. It's one of those components that people would sometimes talk about in lieu of Medicaid expansion, which instead not only works in tandem, but it's in complement with, makes a Medicaid expansion more economically viable and able to serve more people faster on a better schedule. It's one of the things that we've learned under the pandemic circumstances. It's not just a licensing issue, it's a telemedicine issue, it's a technological issue, and a licensing. But yes, it's one of those things that we need to add to the suite of reforms that will bring better coverage to our state.
And I think I'm unmuted now, but that would then also support the outcomes. You'll start seeing outcomes improve just generally. Through the pandemic, we've seen that the trend in using telehealth has made a big difference in the care of patients, and we've got a lot of good support for that now.
Excellent. And it helps with continuity of care, not just in a circumstance where you're not allowed to visit. It's just easier.
Yeah, and they need it more than anybody.
I'm glad the senator answered that question. Full disclosure and transparency, that was my wife that asked that question.
Thank you both. Next question is from Crystal with Children's Health. Crystal, you're up.
Thank you so much. And thank you all again for joining us. This may be more of a systemic question, but and probably to you, Senator, but we currently have the current system, which there is Medicaid and CHIP to help bridge the gap to access to healthcare. But the system provides barriers like moving to a 6-month review over a 12-month, and those little things do affect access to especially our more vulnerable communities. And so, and also given that too, with COVID, also the virtual barriers and certain other things that go along with it. As it relates to CHIP Medicaid, because usually we help our individuals face to face, and we're not able to do that anymore. So, has your office been looking into those types of things as well to kind of help remove some of those barriers of what currently we have as it relates to healthcare access?
Yes, I think I heard 2 categories of barriers. One have to do with regulatory obstacles to telehealth and other things. I have not been carrying the mantle for that one. There's a great effort among many of the leading legislators right now. I think we're going to see quite a few improvements in the regulatory system. I've had input in that, and I fully support it. As to the other barriers you mentioned, there are these structural statutory barriers for recertification, redetermination of eligibility, re-enrollment. They create a morass of red tape. They create hiccups in the system. They result in people getting kicked off who shouldn't have been kicked off. They result in delays in care and coverage. They are designed presumably to prevent fraud. Steve was talking, I can't remember which call, maybe it was on this call, I don't know. There is some concern. We don't want people taking advantage of the system, right? But when it's costing us more to prevent the fraud than the fraud that we're preventing, and we're interrupting something vital like healthcare, we need to reconsider these things. So yes, I actually do have legislation to lengthen the enrollment periods, to stretch out the recertification process to 12 months in certain instances. One frequently cited is eligibility for maternal health care from 2 months to 12 months. Now, a Medicaid expansion would pick most of that up, but not all of it. So I can't, you can list a whole bunch of them, and I've got bills to address several of those. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. We look forward to working with you.
Likewise.
Thanks, Crystal. Next question is from our former board chair, Bill Siegel with Coles and Thompson. Bill.
Yes, I'm just curious what you see the chances of your bill passing.
Well, it depends on which week you ask me, Bill. There are days I feel like it's going to happen for sure, and some when I feel like this is folly. Most of the time, I'm in between there, and right now, I would say there is. I don't want to give it a number. It's a very serious chance, and I don't mean a 1 in 10. So I'll give you numbers. It's a lot better than 1 in 10. It might be 50-50, but that might be too optimistic. But also, political things happen pretty quickly. Right. And what I'm really seeing more than probabilities is I'm seeing tension on the system. I'm seeing tension in the dam. And is it going to break or not? And already we're seeing little sticks come out of it. I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's just really hard to predict. What I can observe is the seriousness with which this issue has been taken, the seriousness of the level and the level of the discussion, the breadth of the discussion, the number of players involved is about 100 times what it was 2 years ago. There's a number.
And those are pretty good odds, and whatever we can do on the chamber end and the business community to help, we want to do that, Senator. Next question is from Aaron Yeager with UT Southwestern. Aaron, do you want to unmute?
Hey, thank you. Yes, this is Erin. I'm also a Dallas resident in Senator Johnson's area. And I wanted to ask if the Biden administration is doing anything to incentivize the remaining 12 states, along with Texas, who haven't expanded Medicaid, to finally go in that direction.
Actually, one thing for sure, and then another, well, there's a variety of things. The one that we mentioned earlier, which is pretty confusing, is offering an additional 5% on the amount of money the federal government gives us for our existing Medicaid population if we expand. That's a huge amount of money. And it could have a absolutely, to go back to Bill's question, pivotal effect on the ability to pass Medicaid expansion this session, because it's going to look really bad if we turn down all that money. That's directly out of the Biden administration. Two other factors. If we're not just going to do a straight Medicaid expansion, if we're going to do a waiver so we can do it the Texas way and get Republican support, which is what I think we're going to have to do, it's still not quite certain exactly what the Biden administration will and won't approve. And so that guidance could be relevant to the conversations that people like me and others on this call are going to be having with legislators. What kind of waiver can we get through? The third thing that's kind of interesting and something to watch right now, that non-expansion renewal that Steve Love brought up a few minutes ago was approved under rather unusual circumstances. In fact, some people would not use the word unusual. They would say contrary to CMS's own guidelines, that it was rushed through without public comment. And the guidelines say you can't rush it through, but they did it anyway. Not only that, on the waning days of the Trump administration, they did all sorts of things to try to say, and by the way, after we rig everything, you can't change it when you get back here. Well, again, I'm not opposed to the renewal of that waiver. It does some really good things for our state. And if it were to be undone by the Biden administration, I would want to see a similar effort from Texas to make sure that we do continue to draw that uncompensated care funding, as well as funding to take care of the district component that we lost, to take care of that other $4.5 million. But that process is a little bit in jeopardy right now. The Biden administration issued a letter yesterday or the day, well, I think it was yesterday, wasn't the weekend, sometime within the last few days, or at least within the last week, that said that anything that was done basically in the last few days or the last month of the Trump administration that violated the things that we would normally do, we're going to look at it again. And so what Texas might get, I doubt we'll get any kind of rejection of our request for support. I think the Biden administration is very, very supportive of Texas's efforts to take care of the indigent and to take care of our healthcare system. But we might get a do-over on the application, which could also affect the whole conversation. So as you can see, it's super complex, is what makes it so fun and difficult to predict.
Senator, if I might add to everything you've said, which is correct, the only thing that I'm hearing out of my sources in DC, some of the states that they may reject and undo those last minute deals had work requirements. Texas did not have a work requirement, so we may slide through. I don't know. It still could be scrutinized. The other thing to help answer your question, I think the Biden administration is going to work closely to try to encourage the 12 states to expand Medicaid by just the people that have been nominated to be in CMS and some of the people who are very experienced and seasoned. They're not confrontational. They look for ways to work together, and let's hope that's the case.
Steve and Nathan, we are approaching our 3 p.m. deadline. Appreciate you all. This has flown by, and as a policy nerd, I've really enjoyed this. Hope it's been educational for everybody else, and we stand by ready to help you all however we can during this session. Before I turn it back over to Crystal, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Malcolmson, who's got a very brief word about some of our regional chamber coalition efforts.
Great. Thank you again, Senator Johnson and Steve, for being here today. We really appreciate it. And Crystal, thank you for your moderating today and being our introducer and welcomer. Thanks, everyone, for your engagement. I just wanted to quickly reiterate something that Jeff mentioned earlier. The Regional Chamber Coalition that's been under the umbrella of the North Texas Commission is taking on very specific agenda items, advocacy efforts during this legislative session. The North Dallas Chamber of Commerce is our priority for all of the regional chambers is Medicaid expansion, or actually, as we refer to it, reducing the number of uninsured. And as Ray Perriman said in his report that's been referenced several times, it just makes sense. And so it's a real privilege for us to work with the likes of Steve Love and, of course, Senator Johnson, who are carrying the load here. And we owe it to them to support them the best we possibly can as we get into the real nitty-gritty of this particular legislative session. So thanks for the opportunity to do that, Nathan and Steve, and we're really looking forward to working with you hand in hand through the balance of the session.
And it is really great and helpful to have your support and direction and stature in the business community.
Thank you.
Well,
Crystal, do you want to close us out?
Sure, would be happy to. Well, thank you both again for joining us today. The Chamber will be making a donation as a token of our thanks and appreciation to you both and all of our speakers for the year to the Austin Street Shelter. So thank you all again. This now concludes our program, but if you wish to continue to network, we'll be sure to leave the lines open to allow for you to do so. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you at our next legislative series session in a couple of weeks. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much.